Well, welcome. We are so delighted to have the two of you here with us today to talk about this great hybrid interpreting technique. Why don't we start by having you introduce yourselves? Michele, tell us just briefly who
Right.
you are.
Well, I've just retired. I was an interpreter at the SKIC, at the EC Commission for 30 years. And I worked for 20 years exclusively in the Italian booth and for nearly 10 years in the English booth as well. And I've just retired. I retired on the 1st of September, and I'm taking it easy now.
And you were the first person to come up with this idea, which we'll talk about in just a second. But first, let's hear from our other guest.
Martin Esposito. I am Rome-born and London-made, on the private market, Italian English, and I've been active for about 20 years full-time and informally a little bit more before that.
And well, the reason we have the two of you on this session today is to talk about Sim-Consec, or simultaneous consecutive. Now, I first heard about this from Michele, so straight from the horse's mouth, if you will, because as he just said, we used to be colleagues for a while. I still work at the commission, and I remember doing some of these test sessions where Michele would just tell us a little bit about the technique in general and also the device that he was using back in the day, which was the smart pen. We'll get to that as well. But Michele, maybe you can just briefly describe to us this situation. So the first time when you used this technique and how you came up with the idea, basically.
Right. Well, at the end of the 90s, I started to become interested in computers. And towards the end of 99, I bought a PDA. It was actually a Cassiopeia 105E, small device. And I started playing around with that. I also had a laptop from work. But when I got assigned to a terrible meeting in Rome, a press conference that was to be in front of 100 people with the then Vice President, Neil Kinnock, I panicked and I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. I won't be able to take notes. He's too fast. He's too dense. I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I just looked at my PDA and my Cassiopeia and I said, why not use that? Just record him and play it back in your headphones and do a simultaneous. So then I, started playing around with the device and testing it. The audio quality was terrible. I don't know how I actually managed to do it. But anyway, I convinced the spokesperson, Neil Kinnock's spokesperson, to go ahead with this idea. And the people in Rome also agreed. And I took a bit of a risk, really, because it could have failed miserably. Anyway, it worked out quite well. I was able to jot down a few things while he was talking, a few difficult words that I wanted to find a good expression for, or things like that, numbers. And then I just went ahead with my simultaneous consecutive, we could say, at this point, since it's received several names, but I suppose simultaneous consecutive is perhaps the one that's most used now, and in its abbreviated form, SimConsec.
And what did you call this at first, Michele?
Right. Well, at first I called it the digitally remastered consecutive. We did a video on this at this geek because you're taking the audio input and you're changing it. Because my idea was that you would maybe accelerate the playback if the speaker is too slow. So you would actually alter the original audio. I didn't have to do that with Neil Kinnock because it was so fast and dense that I couldn't afford to do anything to accelerate it. Certainly impossible, and slow it down would have been very awkward. So that's why I called it digitally remastered. I mean, it was a bit of a, perhaps exaggerated in sophistication, but I could have called it something else. But anyway, it did get called something else subsequently. So that was it.
But it was sort of from the beginning on for you, it was still consecutive, but enhanced in a way, or with a backup, if you will.
Exactly. Enhanced with notes that you could take, even full notes if you really wanted to. But basically, the idea was that you had the advantage of hearing it twice. You hear it first time, you take a few notes and you listen carefully, and you listen to it a second time in your headphones. And you would hope that you can do a better job than both a consecutive and a simultaneous. That was my key point, that you could improve on both.
And how did the situation go? I mean, did it work more or less as you expected? Did you practice a little bit before?
I practiced only for 2 days actually before leaving, so it was a bit of a risk that I took. But when I wrote to my head of service at the time, he was enthused, and he called me up the next morning and said, "Come to my office, and we have to talk about this. We're going to abolish consecutive testing in universities. We're going to write an article in Language International. This is fantastic, blah, blah, blah." 3 weeks later, he was gone because of, I don't know exactly what happened, but anyway, he was replaced by a new head of service who was not really initially that interested. We had other things to do, probably. So it took quite a while before I could pick it up and suggest some tests and go further. But the initial reaction from the head of service at the time was very positive.
Switching over to Martin, we're interested, of course, in your origin story. Do you remember when you first heard about SimConsec? How you got intrigued by that?
I remember being very worried about on-the-field negotiations, and my main problem was I couldn't hear what the speaker was saying. Now, my objective was really to have a portable amplifier to do pure simultaneous interpreting. But I found that with the recording device which I had, which I believe was a micro cassette device, the name escapes me, all these old words, I'm thinking digitally remastered probably also comes from the fact that we used to burn CDs at the time. So yes. maybe that's an echo of that in it. But anyway, I had this recording device, the recording portion of which I wasn't interested in. I found that when I was recording, it amplified into my ears what was happening in the room. By pure chance, an event switched from simultaneous to consecutive. And so I thought, well, since I'm taking notes and doing the consecutive part anyway, I will play back, which I've already heard. And this is in confluence with what Michele has just said. You get the benefits of your notes, which generally, in my case, help me with the gist. But then all the nitty-gritty, the numbers, the names, etc., you get the absolute precision of a simultaneous, of a recording, which creates a simultaneous effect. I hadn't heard of this before. I found out later that other practitioners had been busy. I like to call it polygenesis, which is where people get ideas and then they network together, which is what we tried to do. And that's the second part of the story. So as far as I'm concerned, it was a new idea I had, but other people had had that new idea around the same time or slightly before me.
It's really interesting that it sort of comes up in different places at the same time.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure many other people must have had the same idea. We just don't know about them, and they maybe didn't have the courage to try it out, or the opportunity to try it out. Mm-hmm. And picking up on what Martin was saying, the output can be actually so good that people don't believe it. Now, for instance, a colleague of mine who is blind, he listened to the recording of the conference in Rome, and he said, "Surely you must have had the speech in front of you." I said, "No." He said, "Come on, I can't believe it." I said, "No, honestly, I didn't." And he just couldn't believe that it was so fluent and fast and precise and everything else that Martin said. So there you are. People tend to not believe that it's possible, but it is.
So, Martin, I just have a question for you. When you came up with this, what did you call it?
It didn't have its own name because, as far as I was concerned, it was initially just simultaneous interpreting with a portable amplifier. And then it became recorded consecutive, but that name was for my own consumption only. I never really wrote about it or lectured about it until I started meeting other practitioners, including Michele.
I see one key difference maybe in the notes that you can take as you're doing this, but we'll talk about that in a minute. First, I wanted to ask each of you, it sounds like you've used different types of technology for this technique over the years. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
more or less in order of appearance, microcassette recorders, digital recorders. I remember one occasion I was translating in a monastery atop Mount Lebanon with a digital recorder connected to a solar panel to keep it charged. Then came the wireless headsets connected to the digital recorders. However, this had to happen via a dongle. So basically the dongle took out the wire portion. Later, it was personal amplifiers for the hard of hearing, which is basically a handheld microphone with a very long cable, or once again with Bluetooth. And then in roughly the beginning of the last decade, 2010, 2011, I made it my business to seek out other people. I met Michele, and to go back to the initial question, I settled a few years later on enhanced consecutive as my favorite way of describing this.
In my case, actually, it was just more or less of a theoretical exercise. I mean, beyond the initial big bang of a conference in front of 100 people, I didn't really have that many opportunities to use it. Also because my colleagues weren't very enthusiastic about the idea of a new technology displacing the traditional consecutive. And I was even accused of contaminating the art of the consecutive. So anyway, it was just more or less a theoretical exercise, which was followed up by tests using a computer this time. And that was the idea, that we would accelerate the playback in function of the speaker. So for instance, we had a speech that was very slow. Somebody would really takes it very easy. Now, if you were to do a consecutive from that, of course, you would have to accelerate it. So 20% acceleration, and there you go. So I used in the order the PDA, a laptop computer, then basically the smart pen. So only 3 devices as far as I'm concerned. And pretty limited experience in terms of actual consecutives, because my colleagues would not feel comfortable with me using the pen and they using notes. So we just settled for doing it the traditional way. So, but on the other hand, it did generate a lot of interest in the academic world, and very surprising. I really was very surprised about that. I thought it would just die, but somehow it survived.
Well, it sure did. So we'll get to that in a minute. But I just wanted to say it's interesting what you point out, and I think it shows that we as staff interpreters are in a somewhat particular situation where we do mostly simultaneous and very little consecutive. Although once an active B language comes into the make it slightly different. But interesting to see that to see these reactions and people calling it the art of the consecutive when they probably haven't done it in a long time, but that's beside the point. But what's interesting, I think, about the technique, and that's what I take away from what both of you have been saying, is that in the end, it's a technique, and it's technology neutral. So you could do it with, the LiveScribe Smart Pen, for example. You could do it with a PDA, with a tablet these days, with apps, basically. Right. So I guess that's maybe one of the advantages about that as well. So have you been following these developments or trying it out with different devices? Do you see any device coming out on top?
The smart pen, just for those of you, this is not a session on how to manage or use the smart pen, but just for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a device which synchronizes audio with ink strokes. So basically, when you are writing a note, if anything is said in the room, this is captured by the pen. This means that when the tip of the pen touches that portion of the paper with such an ink stroke on it, the exact audio which was pronounced at that moment is played back to you. There are all sorts of other functions. The pen can take a page and transform it into a PDF, etc., but that's irrelevant to the use of enhanced consecutive. Except perhaps in a training scenario, but that's another story. The alternative is to use a tablet where exactly the same happens. So audio is synchronized not with ink strokes, but with marks taken either in finger or in electronic pen on the screen. The main issue I found with the smart pen was the lack of adoption. If you like, the political dimension, which Michele has just hinted about. Lack of critical mass basically rendered that tool obsolete. The tool has continued in its development, but it has now become quite a different beast. And the main difference lies in the fact that it is now working in tandem with a smart device, a phone or a tablet. For me, the appeal was having one device in your hands and in your ears, and a classic notebook or something that looked very similar to a classic notebook. Once you have two devices, you need a table. And once you have a table, as far as I'm concerned, you are back to my original microcassette recorders with no particular advantage. So there's a story to be told about critical mass and adoption in our community and how we fought and I think lost that battle.
Well, this is something that I think, Alex and I come up across all the time. And often we end up using different commercial tools out there, finding that those prove to be the best option because they're being designed for a broader market. That said, we wanted to turn now to talking a little bit about the actual technique behind this approach. So I've heard you mention a few different things. I've heard you say, for example, that you could speed up or slow down. I've heard you say that you could take notes or take fewer notes and work from the recording. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. What's your basic technique? And then how does this maybe look different from what you might do with traditional consecutive or traditional simultaneous?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't really do it anymore. So maybe I'm not the right person to answer the question. But in my experience, I just stuck to that initial approach. In other words, write down a few things, a few words or expressions, a few numbers. And the advantage of the pen was that you could just, if there was, say, a sequence of numbers being read out at full speed, you would just put a marker on the paper, and then you would be able to focus on that section more specifically and slow it down, which I actually did once in a demonstration at the conference of SCIC conference of the universities. But as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't make sense to take full notes, and you might as well just listen carefully, write down a few things, and trust the fact that you're going to do a simultaneous. That was my approach, and it would be if I had to do it again. I wouldn't change anything.
Bit of a leap of faith then. Yeah, anything you would like to add to that, Martin? Or?
Yes, I'm going to try and draw a daring parallel. At the moment, I'm involved in an experiment of creating a neural network, a deep neural network of artificial intelligence, which obviously already exists, linguistically speaking, in the English language world, but not so much in the Italian side of things. And we are distinguishing sentiment analysis from data analysis. Now, if I go back to those days, my notes were affected by the medium. There are elements in a translation which are crucial, and they are names and numbers and exact data. However, they are not in a way important to the general meaning, the general gist, the general atmosphere you're trying to convey. Sometimes to save a number or to save a name, you will lose the tone of the speaker. You will lose those unfathomable elements, which, on the other hand, are very important for you to give a good final output. I had the feeling that I was able to separate these things and either use the paper for the exact data and the rest for the sentiment, as it were, though more often than not, it was the other way round. I would use the paper for mood, for flow, for connections between the syntactic units, and I would use the pen for exact data. After time, you can customize the flow of the pen practically to follow your own needs. You can slow it down, you can speed it up, you can even skip sections. If you do a lot of government work, you know there are lots of rounds of applause. Now, it's very difficult to predict when a round of applause will break out, but it's very easy to predict when it's going to end. And through a small menu item which was available at the time, it was very simple to skip that net piece, because people don't usually applaud when the interpreter's doing his part.
What a shame.
Or not in the same spots anyway.
Yes, definitely. No, that's a good point, and I think it kind of shows that obviously due to this new technique, you would adapt your approach to taking notes, which I presume then leads some colleagues to being more critical, because consecutive is also often hailed as the mode of interpreting that shows whether somebody can interpret, quote unquote, whether they are able to analyze the speech, that kind of thing. So do you see a contradiction there, or is it just another tool, and is it a perfectly acceptable way of doing consecutive or enhanced consecutive?
Well, I've always believed, and I still believe, that there is absolutely no correlation between ability in the consecutive and in the simultaneous. And I personally witnessed this at a test at the final exams at the interpreting school in Milan. I think it was in 2015. I made a small statistical analysis of the results following the exam, and I proved to the instructors there that the people who were doing very well in consecutive and who were hailed as the best interpreters didn't do so well in the simultaneous, and vice versa. The only exception to that conclusion was actually the German. Interpreting from German, as Alex must obviously confirm, is that it's a different approach, so you can't really draw the same conclusions. But for the other languages, it was true. And I told them, look, why don't you focus more on teaching good simultaneous rather than good consecutive? If the output is not that great, and that's what you're going to do 95% of the time, you better concentrate on that. I don't know if they listened to me.
And did you find that you were developing new symbols that are specific to this technique, like maybe something for applause or something? Would that come up, something that you wouldn't use in normal consecutive?
Well, as I say, I don't really have much practical experience, so I don't really know how I would have gone about it. I would have probably followed many of the suggestions that Martin made, and if I were to use it on a daily basis and introduce some symbols for sure, yeah, and use the pen to make markers at specific points in time in the presence of numbers, applause, and so on. But concerning what Martin was saying about the tone, the emotions, and all that, well, for me, a good simultaneous must capture all that in real time anyway. So I don't really see why you should make any notes on the mood of the speaker, because if you're a good interpreter, you will capture that mood in real time.
If I may add something, the great thing about interpreting is that fruition can be judged by anyone. If you have heart surgery, you don't really know how you would have felt if you hadn't had heart surgery, and you don't know if the way you feel is temporary or permanent, and therefore it's very, very difficult to judge an outcome. You normally trust the surgeon for this. Interpreting is like having a leaking tap fixed. I don't care how complicated it is. If it's still leaking, the job's not done. If people don't understand you, you're doing it wrong. And no matter what's behind it and how many excuses you may have. So what is true interpreting? What is true technique? It's what gives you that result. It's outcome based. If that means using subtitles or a machine which dictates Morse code into your skin, or using a smart pen or anything else, it doesn't matter how you get there, providing you're getting there with legal means. And I say legal means because I'm sure we will touch upon privacy at some point soon. So that's that's my answer to that. Consecutive, I learned later in an academic institution, is the cheaper way of testing a young budding interpreter. You don't need booths for consecutive. So the first couple of years at uni, you will study consecutive interpreting. I completely agree with Michele that this cannot be a mental or technical preparation for simultaneous. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It teaches you to retain, to hold in, to codify, and then later to decode. Exactly the opposite happens in simultaneous interpreting. There is a school of thought, I'm not sure, I don't subscribe to it, saying that consecutive interpreting wouldn't exist if the technology for simultaneous had always existed in the past and was today able to fit in our pocket, bring your own device mode. So perhaps consecutive, difficult as it is and exclusive as it has become, because it's not for everyone, may be on its way out. Who knows?
Bold thoughts, although I'm sure that many people might agree. And I know that Alex and I certainly are seeing many new hybrid approaches being developed, being tested out, what you're discussing about using subtitles, for example, while you're working. One thing that struck me was you were talking about mostly colleagues' reactions, actually, how, especially Michele, you were saying many of your colleagues were averse to this idea. I'm most curious now to hear about the clients. What did the clients say? Did they even notice there was a difference between what you were doing? Maybe you could speak to the institutional market, Michele, and Martin, you could speak to the private market. There may be differences.
Right. Well, the clients in my original experiment were delighted. I received congratulations from the commissioner, from the journalists, and people were surprised that I could actually do a consecutive whilst looking at them straight in the eye rather than fumbling with my notes. So that was a success. As far as the clients in the traditional bilateral meeting setting, I tried it once. Nobody noticed. It went okay, but my colleague was not comfortable. So even though I said I don't have much practical experience using a smart pen or any other device, I do have a lot of experience in consecutive interpretation, bilateral meetings. I've done loads of them. And the clients sometimes actually insist, picking up on what Martin was saying, insist on the real consecutive because they need time to react. I'm sure Josh and Alex and Martin have run into these situations before. So what can you do? You know, if they say, I want a consecutive, I want to have time to think about my answer, well, you know, of course you can do a simultaneous consecutive, sure. And they wouldn't mind. It's more the colleagues. There's also, on the other hand, the issue of privacy that Martin was touching on. And that is a bit of a difficult issue, really. Even though with the original pen, the one I had at least, you could basically take out the SD card and give it to the client. Record everything on the SD card and say, look, here's the SD card. Nothing will remain on the pen. You can be sure that anything that was said is gone. You have it. I don't know about other devices, how easy it would be. Certainly on a laptop, there would be a trace of what you record. I don't know about tablets.
We just lost the end of what you were saying, but I think sorry. We got the gist of it, which was that with hardware, you can simply hand it over afterwards, and with software, you may be able to delete it in front of your clients. What about you, Martin? What's your experience been like?
Well, sticking to clients only, I made sure they saw no difference at all in mode. The pen was very discreet. The cable was black with the right suit. I remember in the early 2000s, Marks and Spencer's here in London created the tech suit, and it had a little Velcro channel going down the lapel where you could hide cables. I'm not sure whether I ever purchased one of that, but the point was I made sure the client never saw, and the client didn't know the difference. Cheekily, having a few clients who've known me for years and where I feel my contract is quite sound, I tried to test the difference against myself, with and without the pen, maybe in more informal settings like dinner speeches where I wasn't risking crashing the NASDAQ. And the comment was always the same. When I was without the pen, everybody said, wow, you're good, but you're a little tired tonight. With the pen, it was always full marks. That's against myself, within the limits of what I can do. So comparing against my own imperfections, of course.
And what about you? Did you have any privacy concerns, confidentiality issues that were ever raised by your clients?
No, but I had a long stint as a public service interpreter and court interpreter where two things are necessary. One is consecutive, because everything is recorded and you don't want an overlap of sound, and therefore you have to hear the original language and so on for the transcripts. And the second one is, of course, it is forbidden to record. So I simply didn't use the smart pen in that setting. Some ideas from colleagues had been vented. One was to encourage the courts and the institutions to purchase their own smart pen so they could wipe it, erase it, etc. The other one, which I tried, was to approach the manufacturers and ask them to reinstate the SD card with a certificate of conformity or an instruction booklet which stated that nothing would remain on the pen's drive. But that's all theoretical. I just didn't use it where privacy was an issue.
Just to add on that, as a side remark, the privacy issue came up when I suggested a different way of producing speeches for interpreters. I suggested, together with our colleague Luis Scherbril, that we could separate the production of speeches from the delivery of the speeches, and we would use the smart pen to record speeches, for example, in Italian. Have them ready on the notebook by title, and then anybody could just come up, click on that title, and deliver the speech shadowing the original speech, which means that people who don't like to write speeches could actually deliver speeches. And I actually just tested it with several colleagues who were enthused, but it was struck down because of the privacy issues.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I'm involved in poetry circles, and if you've written a very long poem which you wish to deliver with the right momentum, again, the pen comes in handy. You just record yourself previously, and then you listen to it as you recite the poet. The final effect is quite astounding.
Great. That's actually a very good transition, because we were going to ask a little bit about other use cases that exist for either the technique or the devices you would use for simultaneous consecutive. So, Martin, you've alluded to that earlier, that the initial sort of target audience for the smart pen were probably students or people taking a lot of notes in meetings, and who would want that additional audio backup to enhance the notes, the meeting notes, I guess. And that's, I think, what made it interesting for the interpreting use case as well. And that's funny, because I had a slight cognitive dissonance there when I heard privacy, because these days it's always used in relation to cloud computing. But of course, this is completely offline. So it was really just about the audio recording. The question being, in any case, is: have you had any more use cases in addition to, interpreting and reciting poetry, possibly training? Have you ever used this for training or coaching for colleagues, students? I don't know, Michele, if you ever used this for pedagogical assistance, maybe?
Absolutely. Yeah, I used it a lot for training, dummy booth training with interpreters getting ready for their test. We would use the smart pen. I would just jot down the parts where there were problems, and we would listen to it again, and it was great. I also suggested using it in tests, so that you could record the speech and the interpretation and make notes and check where things went wrong, because sometimes juries have very strong disagreements. I've been in many selection boards, and there have been problems. Sometimes you have to go back to the notes and no, she said or he said that, and with a pen you have the original, so there's no discussion. So that was one thing, and then the speeches. Yes, as Martin was saying, you can be very discreet in having headphones. So I actually tried a recording session shadowing my own speech using the pen, with the headphones discreetly hidden, and it worked out fine. So I delivered the speech without reading it. Whereas when you look at the speech repository, most people are going like this.
Yes.
So I could just, go like this. But it was struck down because, what are we going to do about the privacy? The speeches will remain on the... Anyway, I just dropped it.
And that eye contact actually does enhance your memory in a way that you wouldn't know if you haven't tried it. Now, the assignments, the use of it are endless. You can have assignment correction, for example, simply by photocopying an assignment on the specially designed sheets of paper for the Smart Pen. You can then add teachers' comments to the assignments. You can email the final document to the student, who will receive a PDF with all the teachers' comments. You can use it for music if you're into sheet music at all, or if you're playing in a band, and rather than taking endless notes in words about what a bar should sound like, you just record it at the rehearsal, play it back to yourself when you're trying to understand how the song goes. Shopping lists on the fridge, they had post-it notes for shopping lists on the fridge. Of course, you have to ensure your other half has got a pen as well. I believe there was even a guitar app where you could make 6 strings on the sheet of paper and you could actually play chords. Privacy has stopped all that. You can't walk around with a recording device anymore, the same as you can't walk around with a camera without asking for permission. Now, I'm completely in favor of GDPR world, etc. I do believe that it's ultimately for our own protection, though it does make you feel straitjacketed at a certain point. What is unclear is why the interpreting profession hasn't enjoyed the same status as a doctor, a solicitor, or a policeman, other people who enter in contact with private information. We seem not to be privy to that level of trust, which is a shame because we hear things anyway. We have documents in our computers the whole time anyway. And I think that I would suspect that some of the stuff we hear is quite unique even for a solicitor.
Yeah, but I mean, what often happens is that the interpreters are blamed, but then the leaks happen elsewhere. And that's certainly an experience that I've made
right.
in the past. Yeah. But if you were to sort of look into the future, I mean, Michele said earlier that he was a little afraid the whole thing would die on the vine, which it didn't. So that's good. People are still using it. People are teaching it. What do you think? How could the whole thing go? Will this be sort of limited to academia, maybe training? Martin, you said, maybe consecutive is going the way of the dodo. Who knows? What do you think could be the future development of this?
So I took this mode on tour a little bit around 2009 for a period of 4 or 5 years. I touched upon London and Rome, of course. I was also in Milan. I went as far as Taiwan for a series of lectures, which included this technique. I find a few problems. I find that the world of interpreting is somewhat overpopulated, and therefore some teaching which takes place is an iteration of what the teachers have in turn received. This means that there is no quest, no drive for evolution or change. There's a proper way of doing it. That gets you your position, your chair at the university, and that's what you teach. This is not exclusive, of course, but this is something I have seen. Then you have the student prejudice. You teach them a new technique. They say, but this is not what we see on television or at the United Nations. I want to be like them. And in a way, it's the students who are aging you in that domain. If you look at the demographics of active practitioners who have a voice at a high level, well, we're looking for a few more young ones and a few more tech-savvy ones. We're seeing the same problem with remote simultaneous interpreting. And it looks like the entry barrier nowadays is not so much how many languages can you speak properly and how good are you interpreting, but can you even switch on and connect with me? Because if you can't, I don't care what qualifications you've got, you're not going to talk. In a way, it's the technicians making the decisions, but how could it be otherwise if that's my way of access to the job itself? Programs like this one, which I'd given up on, so you've really lifted the lid off the coffin, as it were. Programs like this one hopefully will generate a bit of movement. I have so far 8 recorded theses, dissertations, university theses, a couple of which in Trieste, which is very important for us as Europeans, talking about Michele's work, quoting my practical work, but this is Michele's mode, and it's very important to remember that. I have a couple of books have mentioned it, and I think a scholarly article by Mr. Drexel, which I've just found on my computer and I have here before me. Yes, in German, but I'm sure he says lovely things.
Always. But yeah, we can certainly compile a short bibliography. Absolutely. Josh, I think you had some final remarks?
Yeah, certainly some ideas to add to the bibliography with some research that's been done by Mark Orlando on this, particularly for teaching purposes. But we'll make sure that that's available to everyone. I just wanted to end by asking you if you had any funny stories, anything that went exceptionally well or exceptionally terribly when you were doing SimConsec. Some fun experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let Michele go first.
Yeah, just before we deal with that one, I wanted to say that I gave Alex the presentation I'd made at the Skik University's conference, which has all the secondary uses of the pen, the smart pen. So if you want to include that. And as to funny stories, well, actually not really involving the simultaneous consecutive, but the actual traditional consecutive, I saw a couple of disasters happen. It was a long time ago. It was in Greece, and the interpreter was interpreting the prime minister. And he had his sheets of paper, and he wrote down lots of notes. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing fell on the floor. And he couldn't put the pieces together anymore, and it was a complete disaster. So, even the traditional consecutive can fail.
I think we've all been there to some extent.
I certainly have. The oral part, the listening part of the smart pen was a very stunning 3D piece of equipment. The microphones were housed inside the earphones, the other side of the earphones, and it was a most incredible realistic sound. So having left the recording device on at a car manufacturer's massive event with, I think we were out on a race circuit, I then proceeded to play back to interpret. And the previously recorded sound of a car approaching at high speed scared me so much. I literally jumped in the lap of my client as I thought I was going to be run over. But of course, I was the only one hearing it at the time. It took a little bit of explaining, but I think we're still good friends.
That's a wonderful story. And I think a very good story to end with, don't you think, Josh? So thanks to both of you, Martin and Michele, for being so generous with your time, your knowledge and your experience and sharing that. And
it was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for us as well. And we hope to be able to sort of keep the flame alive, the flame of simultaneous consecutive or enhanced consecutive, and hope to make a small contribution to that.
Yeah, and we'll be talking all about the newest technology for that, how you can do this using a tablet and a stylus. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear that.
Thank you very much then.
Thank you.
Lovely to speak to you.